Hello and welcome in to another episode of the Fantasy Football Forecast. I am Trevor Scott here with my co-host Matt Giraldi,
What's going on, guys?
and I am recording from beautiful Santa Ynez, California. As you can see, I am on the road. So looking forward to getting into it though. And today we are going to be discussing a running back to the first running back decision that you're probably going to have to decide, and that is between Breece Hall and Bijan Robinson.
Yeah, so these guys right now, there's a lot of healthy debate going on. They kind of seem to be that clear tier two. Obviously, McCaffrey is going to be the first running back off the board, but you're seeing these guys kind of flip flop a little bit. So yeah, that's the goal of the episode is to dive in and kind of stake our claim with who we think is the best option.
And I personally think that this is going to be one of the most difficult decisions in the later part of the first round for a lot of fantasy owners, because not only do you have to weigh these guys against each other, but you also have to figure out when you're comfortable going running back over receivers. So I think that this decision on these two players is going to be very important in terms of your top end of your draft. So we're looking forward to getting into it. So these guys, like you mentioned, are 2 and 3 in the ranks right now. And both are a little scary to pick, I think, too, because we're projecting these guys to do so much better than they did last year, um, in terms of putting them at 2 and 3, and what you would hope to get out of those positions at running back. So they have some major upside, but it's not exactly like they have realized that upside yet to this point in their career. So we'll get into Breece Hall first. So looking at his 2023 results, he finished as RB4, but a significant majority of that production came at the end of the season. So he played all 18 games, but he was coming back from an ACL, didn't get a full workload until maybe week 5, week 6, um, and then didn't really become the major feature part of the passing game that he was until maybe week 10 or 11. So they really kind of unleashed him. We're giving him 20 plus touches a week after that. So you can see the numbers here, right? 993 yards and 5 touchdowns on the ground, 4.5 a carry. And the target share, like I mentioned, was just massive. 90 total targets, 76 for 591 and 4. So that's really where a lot of his production and a lot of his overall numbers came from, was in the through the air, and as that fourth running and kind of pushed him into that fourth overall running back last year.
Yeah, I mean, he and Garrett Wilson were obviously the focal points of that offense. And just, the poor quarterback play led to a lot of checkdowns to Breece Hall, obviously wanting to get the ball in the playmaker's hands, things like that. It's going to be a very different look this upcoming year with Aaron Rodgers back and healthy. So looking at, the projections via Fantasy Pros, they've got him ranked at RB2. I know right now on Underdog in Best Ball, he's RB3. They've got him at 1,200 yards, 11 rushing touchdowns, 570 receiving yards, 5 receiving touchdowns. So they're pushing for a really, big year from him. And from my perspective, I do have Breece right above Bijan at this point. I'm kind of sticking with that. That's kind of what I've been at all off season. And the biggest thing for me, and while he won't be as much of the focal point, is this offense is going to be a lot more efficient under Aaron Rodgers. So, there's going to be a lot more scoring opportunities. They're going to be on the field a lot more, but looking kind of into the weeds of it past Aaron Rodgers, their main goal of the offseason was to shore up the offensive line and keep Rodgers upright. So, they traded for, right tackle, left tackle. They drafted Olu Fashanu in the first round, who you and I are both, very high on as well. So I think, obviously a good O-line is a running back's dream, and a good quarterback running an efficient offense as well. But the biggest thing for me that kind of separates these two guys is Breece really has that home run ability that can win you any given week. So we know he's a 4.39 guy. He's definitely faster than Bijan, but we've seen him, over the past couple of years, like be able to rip off these, 60-yard touchdown runs and put up these, very high ceiling weeks. I don't know what you think about that overall.
Yeah, I think he's got a high ceiling weeks, but like I'm not sure we really saw that last year in terms of rushing only. He had that one week against the Broncos, like in week 4, where he had like 170 in the touchdown. But other than that, he didn't rush for over 100 yards but one other time during the whole year. And it was like towards the very end of the year, like week 15, I think he went over 100 yards. Obviously, he had this major passing game role that we just went over. But in terms of hitting the home run, I remember before he kind of got cut loose too. In week one, he had that 80-yard rush that pushed him right up around 100 yards. So I don't include that one from like a projectability standpoint because I mean he had 5 carries and it was like I think 95 or 100 yards or whatever. But I think Breece is getting pushed up, and obviously his finish pushed him into the top end of running backs. But really, for a lot of last year, he was overwhelmingly bad and overwhelmingly disappointing. So I think that there's at least a chance that there's somebody listening that didn't make the playoffs because Breece Hall was their main running back, and he just didn't produce well enough through the middle weeks of the year, and it was just hurting owners that had him, unfortunately. And so I always have that in the back of my mind going into this year, and obviously the offense is going to be better, and ideally he'll have better running lanes, and the 4.5 yards per carry looks good. But if you look from week 5 until week 11, I bet I would be willing to bet that it was like right around 3 because it was just constantly 15 carries, 55 yards type of production. But then the passing game would bail him out, right? He'd have 9 targets,
Right.
7 catches, 50 yards in a rush, in a receiving touchdown or whatever. And then it's like, okay, that's obviously a monster week, but the rushing wasn't that good. And so for me, I'm worried that they're going to have Rodgers now with Garrett Wilson. They brought in Mike Williams, who's a big time pass catcher, and that Breece's role in the passing game isn't going to be the number 2 option. And if he's not the number 2 option, I'm very concerned about him even coming close to 570 yards or 5 receiving touchdowns, because these projections are a little bit over the top. I mean, that is a monster projection,
Yeah.
17, 70, and 16. Like, I don't remember seeing a projection like that since prime Derrick Henry. And so, and obviously like McCaffrey, but that's different. So like, I don't know that I can get behind these projection numbers, especially the rushing number, but also the receiving number for the reason I just outlined, right? That if he's not getting the volume, like if he only has 50 receptions instead of 67, his efficiency in the passing game is going to have to be so much better than it was last year, and I don't know that that's going to happen. So like
That's it. Go ahead.
go
Sorry.
ahead.
I was just going to say, like, that's a big projection on the receiving side because that's more
Yeah,
than he did last year when that was, their true number 2 option, and they were just force feeding him.
right. And it was, the offense was really bad. So not to say that his production wasn't legitimate, but like the offense was bad. So it was basically read to Garrett Wilson. If he was open, throw it to him because he was getting like 10, 11 targets a game towards the end of the year. And if not, it was just a dump down to Breece Hall, and he was getting these huge target shares. I mean, he had a game with like 15 targets in the playoffs, in the fantasy playoffs. So I don't know. I don't expect that the receiving numbers are going to be that massive when the offense is going to be more efficient, right? Like, and the greater efficiency will also help him, but in terms of his role and like seeing this many targets, and I think his rushing uh, attempts will increase, right? Where you see on here, it's 223 for the whole season. I think that will go up. He'll be in the 260, 270 range, which is a lot more. So that's 2 or 3 more a game. So with the big playability, if he does, you know, hit another long run or two, that will help his overall numbers. But even 40 more carries at 4.5 a carry, that's not exactly like gonna make him like he still wouldn't quite get to 1,200 yards there. So
Yeah.
I don't know. I think it's an interesting conversation here, and Breece Hall is gonna land as my number 2, and we're gonna talk about that overall. But I can't imagine I'm gonna have a team where I get him at all.
It's a tough spot because, you're looking at, that tier of receiver after Amon-Ra, where you're going to kind of have to make that decision if you want to push up, Garrett Wilson, or if you want to push up Puka, AJ Brown. Obviously, it'll depend on, league format and if it's a 3 wide receiver league, that might be a more difficult decision. But yeah, I tend to agree with that, just because in that scenario, I'm probably going to go with like an AJ Brown, but um, we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see where he ends up settling, especially in our main league, because if we end up with the ninth pick and AJ Brown goes 8, and you're deciding between like a quarterback or Breece Hall, um, I just think I'm going to end up picking the quarterback, right? I'm going to pick Mahomes, or I'm going to pick, um, CJ Stroud, or I'm going to pick Lamar
Yeah,
Jackson instead of going Breece Hall, and kind of hope that somebody else takes him, because and then somebody else falls a little bit further, and I end up with Garrett Wilson in round 2 type of thing,
hmm,
or just lock in Garrett Wilson in front of him, because if you want to talk about somebody who I think is going to benefit in a major way from Rodgers coming back, right? I mean, even
yeah,
more so than Breece, I think is going to be Garrett Wilson. So, we'll see as we move forward if I start to soften on getting a running back early. I just think in a 3 wide receiver league, especially, it just puts you behind the 8 ball so far. If you're later in your first round and you don't secure a receiver there, it just turns into playing catch up at receiver throughout the rest of the draft.
yeah. And just for anyone else that isn't aware, Trevor's talking about in the terms of a super flex format. So if you think he's crazy for considering QB in the first, that's the reason why.
Yeah, always super flex. So make sure you watch our Superflex content. We've been trying to sell you guys on it. If you guys are just joining us now, or if you're coming back and watching this video, keep going back a little further and look at some of our Superflex stuff. Maybe show it to some of your league mates to try and convince them to go to Superflex, because it's worth it. It is a very fun format. So let's get into Bijan. So number 2 uh, running back in this video that we're talking about, number 3 overall in the 2024 projections. He finished as RB9 last year, despite the Arthur Smith aspect of having to deal with that. He had 213 carries, 83 targets, 8 total touchdowns. Very good season, like pushing 1,400 yards, just under that. And this one is interesting because he's going to get a new offensive system, and it just felt like he could have had such a better year. You just kept looking up and seeing Algier with 20 touches in a game randomly, and it was like, why are we doing this? Or Bijan would have 7 or 8 touches in the whole game, and it was like, what was the thought, or what was the idea here? He got drafted very highly last year too. I mean, he was the 4th or 5th running back off boards last year, getting pushed right back up to that. And I expect that he's going to be very good in Kellen Moore's offense. So, what do you think here?
I agree with that. I just think, with Atlanta as well as, the other guys, there's a lot of projection baked in because, Kyle Pitts, we're kind of doing that same thing again this year. Drake London's getting pushed
Not Kyle
way up
Pitts.
draft boards. Bijan, I don't really understand what Arthur Smith was doing last year, and he got fired for it. But Tyler Algier had 200 touches on the season. It's not like he's this electric change of pace, Tajay Spears type
That was a
backup. He
plotter.
was just, yeah, he was just sort of there, and it was just so disappointing with all of the hype around Bijan to see what happened. And so hopefully, with the new regime, things will be different. And
Yeah.
I'm pretty comfortable where he's at RB3, but kind of that same tune with Breece. I don't know if I'm going to end up with a lot of him, just given kind of the format and the way that you and I typically draft. But there's a strong case to be made that if you're going hero RB and you're at the end of the first round, that's, someone that you want to build your team around. And, he was quoted not too long ago saying the team plans to use him like Christian McCaffrey. And, maybe he's just saying that. Maybe someone told him that, that kind of remains to be seen. But I think people hear that and, they might push him up a little bit because we know the talent, we know the draft profile, we know, all of the things that surround him. So, hopefully he gets his fair share of touches this year. But looking at the projections, they've got him just under 1,000 rush yards, 6 TDs, which I feel like that aspect of it is a little low in my opinion. Obviously, they're going to use him as a receiver. I don't know. It feels like there should be a little bit more lopsidedness with the rush and receiving touchdowns, but I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, and Bijan is somebody like I guess I expect Breece Hall to go in front of Bijan. So in like a super flex format, when people are feeling the same way as we are, if you have pick 6, 7, 8, that type of range, right, and Bijan falls to the middle of the second round, when you're picking at 14 overall, 15, 16 overall, that's when I would want to strike on Bijan. I
Mhm.
think, if Puka is kind of already gone or the top tier of quarterbacks have all gone, all five of them have all gone by that, say, 15th pick, and you're looking at Bijan, that's when I feel like getting in on a hero RB build would be most ideal, right? Say as at pick 6, you got Justin Jefferson, Bijan comes back to you at 15. That's a very good start. Even like, and that's only reasonable in a super flex league, right? Obviously, the quarterbacks have to go in order to push Bijan down, but that's where I would be looking personally to strike on
Mhm.
Bijan, right? I still would take the quarterbacks, that whole first tier, over him, but
Mhm.
I think that's kind of where the iron is hot for me in terms of taking Bijan. So I do really really like Bijan too. I think like I have Breece ranked over Bijan right now, but I think for where I feel like I'm going to be able to get him, Bijan is somebody that I want. I guess it's somebody that I actually want to try and get. And you mentioned the touchdown disparity. That's kind of where the question started, and I think more in projections more than like how they're scored. I think it's that they're scored. So, if you're projecting somebody for 12 touchdowns, it's more of like a technicality on how they're scored. Maybe they think he
Sure.
gets a screen pass, at the 5 yard line, and they, he's able to get in there the 10 yard line, and he's able to get those type of scores, and Kellen Moore does that a lot, right? I mean, if you look at Tony Pollard over the last few years, or obviously when he was with the Chargers, that's my guess as to why they have the receiving touchdown so high, is because the running backs in those offenses, specifically Pollard and Eckler, scored a lot of receiving touchdowns. So, when they're
Yeah.
modeling this, it's not exactly like they're sitting here like you and me just trying to pick out numbers. Like they're creating a model that's generating these numbers. And when you plug in Kellen Moore's offense, the receiving touchdowns are going to be high for the running back. So that's my guess as to why it's broken down like that. Um, but I look more at just like the total scores, right? 12 touchdowns
Yeah.
feels like a good bet, right? That's something, as long as he's healthy, he's going to get a good amount of scores. And I think that in getting the passing game work here, I'm much more confident that he's going to get that passing game work than I am with Breece Hall. They had similar total targets last year, without that 16 or whatever it was, 18 target game from Breece. They would have had the same number of targets. Breece was obviously much more efficient in terms of catch percentage because uh, Bijan only had 58. But I think in Kellen's offense that he'll be much better off, and that those targets are going to be a lot more catchable. With Kirk Cousins, they're going to be a lot more on target than with somebody like Ritter. Ritter, would take off and run. There's going to be none of that with Kirk Cousins. So I expect Bijan to have an excellent year through the air. So that 700 or that I'm sorry, that 574 with 6, I think that is very achievable in a way that I didn't think so with Breece. So and obviously the rushing yards are down, and we mentioned Tyler Algier, and I do want to defend. Like obviously we all were whining about it because they took Bijan really high, but I do want to defend Tyler Algier a little bit in terms of the fact that it was his second year, and he, as a rookie, he rushed for over 1,000 yards.
Yeah.
So it's not exactly like he was a scrub, right? So when Bijan was coming in and starting to get established, Algier at the beginning of the year, getting a workload that was substantial wasn't exactly surprising. It was something that was talked about a lot leading up to the season, that it wasn't necessarily just going to be the Bijan show um, straight out of the gate. And Tyler Algier was a very popular sleeper, was on a lot of rosters, was started in a good amount of
Mhm.
leagues through the first half of the year. So um, this year, obviously the offense is changing, but I think even more than that, it's Tyler Algier's third year, and he didn't do so well with his touches, right? Not as efficient last year. And it's Bijan
Right.
Robinson's second year, right? He's got a full year under his belt. He's healthy, new offense. He's going to be the guy going into the year. And I think he's going to hit the ground running in a way that he didn't last year. So the Tyler Algier thing, I don't expect to be as big of a deal.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it's just such a shame that these guys have had such atrocious quarterback play.
Both
Obviously
of
they're
them.
both young and now they're getting huge upgrades. So I think that's gonna be awesome. And
Yeah.
just touching on
And
your point about hero RB and where you're comfortable taking this. If you're listening and you hear the buzzword hero RB, don't think that that means that you have to like reach on a guy in the first round. If the board is falling in a certain way and you're planting your flag and you can get this guy potentially early second, don't think that you just have to reach in the first because you are doing hero RB. So
right.
always do what the board gives you. And but yeah, it's just kind of a side tangent.
No, I agree. To elaborate on that a little bit, if I end up with one of these guys, the hero RB element to it is there are so many in our format, there are so many other spots that you have to fill out, right? You have to get three receivers. You have to get a flex spot that's probably going to be a receiver, and you have to get multiple quarterbacks. So drafting one of these running backs early, and I think it's kind of all the way into the top 10. Like if you draft one of these top 10 running backs, but especially if you invest high draft capital in a running back, I think it's so important that you wait for your second running back. Unless there's some insane value, like you get Derrick Henry at the end of the fourth or Travis Etienne in the middle of the fourth, like that type of value at running back, I think it's critical that you wait because you can hit on somebody or you can have a couple bench guys and you end up instead of having to mess with your wide receiver 3 and your flex, you end up just trying to mine a running back, which one injury in a big fab bid can kind of fill that role, right? So you don't even necessarily need to draft somebody that you're going to be playing in that spot during the year. So when I mentioned hero RB, that's because when I pour a bunch of draft capital into a running back, I am going to rely on that as my one, and I'm not going to be looking to fill my RB2 very quickly after that. So I'm glad you brought it up because I want to make sure that that's clear.
Yeah. No, I agree. All right, man. Any lasting
Right.
thoughts on this tier?
Yeah. So in conclusion here, kind of right, we both have Breece Hall as the top option of these two, right? So if you're going to be sitting on the clock at pick 9 and you want to go running back, we're both going to be picking Breece Hall in that situation. His projection, obviously, we talked about is significantly higher. The offense is going to be a lot more efficient, and if he does still continue to keep that number 2 option in the passing game, he's going to have a monster ceiling. He can actually legitimately contend with McCaffrey in a way that nobody else is going to be able to. So, the upside is very much there. We discussed some of the downside, but that's why we have him as number 2. Bijan, the second of these options, I think he's going to go multiple picks after Breece Hall, which is why I kind of have him targeted or put away as somebody that I could see being my RB1. Um, and his projection first year after Arthur Smith feels conservative, right? I mean, he's still not projected for 1,000 rushing yards, which I think we can all agree that he has the upside to have much more than 1,000 rushing yards. So if he does end up hitting his rushing ceiling with how much Kellen Moore is going to get him the ball in the passing game, I think that there's a also potential monster season waiting here for Bijan on the upside end of it. So definitely number 2 and 3 in our rankings too. There's a tier drop after this. We don't really have anybody else considered in the top 3, and we'll break down tier 3 in a future video.
Cool, man. Love it.
All right, and with that, we're signing off. Have a good one, guys.
Later.